Chapter 2, The Birth of the American Circus. In 1805, a man named Hacheliah Bailey, I hope that's pronounced correctly, although they called him Hack, but Hacheliah was his long name. In 1805, he bought an elephant in a stockyard in New York City, which is sort of hard to imagine that it was there. But he paid $1,000 for it, which was the equivalent of 70 head of cattle. And he intended to use the elephant as a draft animal. He thought it would help him in his farming. It would be very efficient. So he takes this elephant up the Hudson River on a ferry, and then, not that far, but it took a little while to get there, and then he has to walk him 17 miles to his farm. Well before he got to his farm, he realized that using this elephant as a draft animal was actually a terrible idea, because he just ate and pooped too much. He just needed an enormous amount of food, and he pooped these huge things. And so anyway, because he couldn't turn him into a farm animal, and because he'd spent $1,000 to get him, he thought, well, I'll show him for money. So he named the elephant Bet. P.T. Barnum at this time was a youngster. And he lived across the river in Connecticut, where his father ran a general store. And P.T. Barnum heard about Bet back then, and Hacheliah Bailey was, as far as Barnum was concerned, was the founder of the American Circus. So in 1812, Hack sold Bet to somebody else, to an equestrian troupe. And so they were going to, the horses and the acrobats on the horses, but this troupe realized very quickly that actually the elephant was a much bigger draw than their horses. So they built a platform on top of Bet, and they had the acrobats jump on it and do somersaults off of it. So Bet became the first performing elephant in America. And then in 1816, a farmer who was annoyed that it cost 50 cents to see Bet unloaded 2 barrels of his shotgun into her ear. And so Bet also became the first elephant that was murdered in America. Hack Bailey in 1817 bought Little Bet, number 2. She was an 11-year-old Asian. 9 years later, and he toured her. And in those days, she wasn't performing. People just paid to come and see an elephant. Oh my God, where else? It's this mythical creature. So he toured her for 7 years, and then a couple of boys, who heard that musket balls wouldn't penetrate an elephant's hide, decided to test it out. And so they lined up all their muskets, and they shot her, and they killed her. Then Hack Bailey got Columbus. And Columbus was the first male elephant in America, and he was the biggest. And he died quite suddenly for reasons we're not sure right now, a few years later in 1837. And then Hack Bailey replaced him with an elephant named Mogul, only he changed Mogul's name to Columbus. So he just pretended it was the same elephant. This was common practice in America. So there are a lot of elephant names which were used repeatedly, again and again, applying to different elephants, and you have to be sort of a detective to find out which one was which. This replacement, Columbus, died 4 years later when he fell through a bridge in North Adams, Massachusetts. This was also quite common. Elephants fell through bridges regularly in North America, and then they started swimming them across the rivers instead until they started building stronger bridges. Hack Bailey, in 1825, built the Elephant Hotel in Somers, New York, with the Museum of the Early American Circus on the 2nd floor. And Benedict Arnold and other historical American figures knew the Elephant Hotel were there. It is still there if you want to see it. Hannibal. In 1840, Hannibal was the largest elephant in America. That's how he was billed, and it was likely true. He was nearly 12 feet tall, and they measure elephants at the shoulder, and he weighed 15,000 pounds. He went on annual rampages when he went into must, and must is this thing that happens to mature male elephants, and it happens a few months every year, and they just pretty much go wild, and their scent glands here on the side of their face, they just ooze and dribble, and they can be very hard to manage. And it's not actually connected to estrus in the female. It is a totally separate thing that happens to males. And so early elephants in America, the male elephants, they really had no idea what to do when the elephants were going into must. So Hannibal went into must and he had rampages regularly. But the circus had made up the story about Hannibal, that he had a broken heart. And so the public was very forgiving of him because he's doing this because he has a broken heart. And in fact, there was a little bit of truth to that. Hannibal had met another elephant named Anne in 1843 when they were side by side in winter quarters in Philadelphia, I think. And by all accounts, they had genuine affection for one another. They would, just entwine their trunks and nuzzle up, and they seemed to like one another. But when winter was over, Anne was sold to another circus, and she went away. Hannibal never met her again, and Hannibal went on a tear. The keeper gave him whiskey. Again, not uncommon to give alcohol to elephants in early America. And the keeper said, quote, that even though he drank eagerly of that consoling beverage, his moroseness and fury only increased. Earlier, as a teenager, Hannibal had been in a circus with 3 other elephants, and one of them, named Columbus, hated him. So in Algiers, Louisiana, where they were on tour with the circus, Columbus broke loose and charged Hannibal, and Hannibal just knocked him off his feet because he was bigger. And then the keepers got Hannibal away, but Columbus, who arguably was a bad elephant, he went on a tear. He killed horses, he killed a llama, he killed 2 mules, he killed a slave that was just sitting on the fence. He killed mules that were drawing a wagon and their wagon driver. The people said that it was more terrifying than when the British invaded in 1812, the Battle of New Orleans, that Columbus was more terrifying than that. The militia opened fire on him in guerrilla fashion. He was shot 20 times, but he performed the next day. The circus paid more than $20,000 in damages, the largest single cost of which was $18,000 to recompense the owner of the slave that had been killed. 6 years later, in Philadelphia, Columbus killed his keeper, and he went on another tear, and he tore about wagons, and he let the tiger loose, and he was generally creating havoc and pandemonium and chaos and terror, and the Philly mayor ordered out the militia and the field artillery and 50 muskets, but thankfully the bull men got to Columbus first and restrained him, and so he didn't get killed that time. Later that year, Columbus ripped open a rhino cage and went after the rhino. Finally, in 1851, Columbus died falling through a bridge, just like his namesake. The other 2 males that were in that troop with Hannibal when he was young, they were more docile. 2 of them drowned while they were chained together to swim the Delaware River, which is a shallow river. I have tubed on it many times. And Anne, Hannibal's sweetheart that he never saw again, died after drinking a barrel of ice water. Unlike Columbus, who was mean, Hannibal was promoted as having a broken heart, and the public loved him. He went on rampages. In 1854, he went on a tear in Rhode Island. In 1859, he went on a tear in Williamsburg, Virginia. In 1861, he ripped up Philly. But again, they were forgotten. The public is like, oh, he has a broken heart, we love him. In fact, Hannibal killed his keeper in 1862, but he wasn't charged with a crime. It was justifiable manslaughter, and the judge let him off because he'd been abused. In 1865, Hannibal marched in D.C. after Grant took Richmond. He was draped with the flag in the parade. The next one up, he marched in New York City after Sherman took Savannah. And then back in D.C., he went and knelt before the War Department. All this is in the newspapers and everything. Hannibal died 2 days after Lincoln was buried and a month after Lee surrendered. The circuses in early America were always making stories about their elephants and giving them names and dressing them in clothes and, personifying them if they could. So, and having them act out Shakespeare. So there was a Romeo and Juliet in America for a long time, and it was the same Romeo, but it was different Juliets. The first Romeo and Juliet fell through the Mohawk Bridge onto the rocks below. Romeo somehow survived that intact. Juliet broke her shoulder. Romeo wouldn't leave her. They finally scared Romeo away by bringing mastiffs that nipped at his heels, and they got him away, and then they had to build a shed over Juliet and leave her to die. Juliet number 2 danced for Romeo in the act as he sat on a stool and cranked a hand organ, and I cannot imagine how an elephant is cranking a hand organ, but they did. Then she got traded to another circus, where she learned to walk on a tightrope 4 feet over the ground. She died in an 1860 publicity stunt, swimming across the Ohio River off of Cincinnati. Juliet number 3 joined up with Romeo for Maybe's Circus, and they toured the Midwest in a grueling schedule. So in 161 days, Maybe's Circus set up and broke down 278 times. So that's more than once a day. They're putting everything up and taking everything down. At the end of that long season, they arrive at their winter grounds in Delavan, Wisconsin. This is home to me. As a kid, we had a summer house on Lake Delavan, and we heard these stories about the elephant at the bottom of Delavan Lake, and that was Juliet number 3. She died. They had to have Romeo pull her out onto the ice. They couldn't bury her. They couldn't dig in the ground. It was winter in Wisconsin. Romeo dragged Juliet out onto the ice, where she stayed until spring melt and then fell down. Years later, decades later, maybe a century later, they actually built a fiberglass statue of Romeo in town. But that was Juliet number 3. Then the circus was sold to a guy named Forepaugh, and he brought in Juliet number 4. Romeo was now considered, quote, the most vicious, vindictive, and dangerous elephant in the country. He had killed 3 keepers, and he would still kill 2 more. When he met his new Juliet, they decided to do it in the dark, and they had each of them staked on a 100-foot chain, and they had them 200 feet apart, so the idea was that they could actually go and be nose to nose in the middle, but they couldn't kill each other overnight if that's how it turned out. So that's what they did, and they did it in the dark. And when they came back in the morning, Juliet had slipped her chains, and she was over hanging out with Romeo. But that was not what this new circus master wanted to do. He was really he wanted to break Romeo's spirit. And so I'm going to read you this because it was just disgusting. So Craven, his new keeper, proposed that confirming him beyond the power of resistance and then beating him until he trumpets forth his subjection and yields submission to his tormentors. That was the plan, to make Romeo a more obedient elephant. So he shot birdshot into his trunk. Didn't work so much. He's trying to get Romeo down on the ground. He's got his guys trying to hook up his legs with a block and tackle. So then he comes up with a shotgun again. He shoots him right in the face, and he puts out one of his eyes. At this point, the block and tackle guys managed to get Romeo off his feet, and he's now on the ground. And then it took 12 shots for them to do that. And then for 8 hours, and again, I'm going to quote him, he belabored him with iron rods and wounded him with the bullhook innumerable times until he was brought under complete subjugation and begged loud and long for mercy. The next season in Must, Romeo knocked down and killed his handler, knelt on the chest of him. There was one more to go. Romeo's feet were chronically infected, which is very typical for elephants. Actually, more elephants died of foot infections than any other reason. and we just didn't really know. During the course of the 19th century, finally, handlers began to realize that there was a real correlation between the mood of an elephant, the temper of the elephant, and their dental health and their foot health. And if those two things were taken care of, if their teeth and their feet were taken care of, then they might actually not be so mean. In the wild, they can, elephants can walk 30 miles a day or 40 miles a day, but they were not walking on, the walking that they were made to do here was often further, and it was not on great terrain. The surgeon looks at his feet and decides he needs to remove some of the small bones in the feet have been crushed. So he does surgery and he opens up and takes out the dead bones. Gallons of blood, apparently, that had been pooling in his feet spilled out, and Romeo was dead within 2 days of sepsis. Yet, his obituary in the paper in 1872 said that his pride was unconquerable, because Romeo was mythologized as that, as this noble being. Americans, after the Civil War, understood the grand historic gesture, and Romeo sort of fit that bill.